Joining us now is Crikey's election analyst, William Bowe. Welcome to the studio. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
The Guardian began an editorial today with the words, "What a dispiriting election campaign it's been." Do you agree?
I do, and I don't say that lightly because I have rarely seen an election campaign where you didn't hear these sorts of complaints. You know, there's a great deal of cynicism about the political process at the very best of times, but in this of all campaigns, I think, you know, the Labor Party in particular are bringing in so much baggage into the contest, and all that Tony Abbott has sought to do is, you know, make himself a smaller target as he conceivably be in case to an election victory. So it has not been inspiring.
So are you saying that most of the time, by the time we get to this stage, we always tend to play down how a campaign has gone? Have we all got collectively very short memories?
Oh, absolutely we do. And, you know, the cynicism is well founded. Obviously, an election campaign is a choreographed, stage-managed process, and those who look to politics for inspiration are usually disappointed by them. It's just a matter of degree, and this has been, you know, one of the more dispiriting ones that I've witnessed.
William, you've been following the polls very closely in your blog, Poll Bludger. How much of a science is predicting election outcomes?
It's half art and half science because the polls invariably scatter around a bit. There are a range of methodologies at work, and you don't know until the big day who's done the best job and what it is about what they were doing that made that poll more accurate than all of the others. I've got to say, though, the polls have been fairly consistent and constant throughout this campaign, particularly towards the end of it. I think maybe we've seen a couple of pollsters tweak their methods in order to bring them in line with everybody else. That's a sort of phenomenon of herding that you can get in the polls. Yes, we've witnessed that in the US, and I think there's been an element of that here. Then the consensus viewpoint has been that it's, you know, I think all the late polls have been coming in, with one exception, sort of 53, 47, 54, 48, 46, sorry.
Do you agree with people who criticise Australia specifically for saying we depend too much on poll outcomes?
I doubt that it's a particularly Australian phenomenon. I mean, in any modern democracy, the activities of any party during an election campaign are market research to within an inch of their lives. There's so much at stake, even leaving aside the ideological dimensions of the contest. A lot of people's careers at stake. They're not going to leave anything to chance. So, and you know, this ties back into the whole process being dispiriting. You know, there's very little room for theatricality and instinct in modern politics. And that's, you know, a lot of people are reacting against that, and I think that's driven perhaps the move we've seen in late polling towards Clive Palmer.
Well, before we get on to people like Clive Palmer, you were talking about the lack of theatricality. Yesterday there was quite a bit of theatrics, mainly around the internet filter policy, and there were a few sparring, you know, interviews going on as well. Is that because at this stage of the game people just get tired and they get unhinged, or is this a build-up of frustration? What's that about?
Perhaps theatricality wasn't the right word. You always do get an element of that in a campaign. But what's interesting, I think, is that, you know, we did see a pretty major bungle yesterday from the coalition, which is surprising. It's supposed to be the losing side that's making the bungles at this stage. Not that Labor's campaign has been free of them by any stretch of the imagination. It's a little bit surprising to see a party that appears to be coasting to victory, doesn't have any need to sort of take risks or anything, you know, put themselves under the furnace in the last few days of the campaign with this sort of mistake. So, you know, it was an unforced error, and, you know, I don't know how much you can read into it in terms of what it's going to matter for the result. But, yeah, probably, you know, you get cabin fever, people get tired, and, you know, I guess naturally a bit of fatigue creeps in.
Do you have a sense of how that mistake might play out in terms of voting, if at all?
Oh, not much, you know. It matters a lot to a certain segment of the voting community. You know, a lot of young people. You shouldn't necessarily stereotype these sorts of IT tech issues as being exclusively of interest to young people. But the sort of, you know, freedom of expression dimension of that issue, caused Labor a lot of damage when they were proposing an internet filter with that kind of young cohort. And at the last election, I think it was one of the things that fed into the extraordinarily good result we had for the Greens last time around. So it has an electoral effect, these sorts of issues. They are out there, but it's not the bread and butter sort of issue that really, swings the voters who matter out in the marginal seats who are inclined to change their vote from one election to the next.
Let's talk about some of the other, I suppose, the other parties and the other personalities. From what you've gleaned in this campaign, what are people like Clive Palmer, the WikiLeaks party, some of the other minority parties, Bob Katter, how are they going to poll?
Well, you always get these sorts of sideshows to a certain extent. There's always a market out there for someone who does break the mould and isn't paying the politician. We've seen this phenomenon in many different times, in many different forms, going back probably even to Don Chip, a very long time ago now. It's been especially pronounced, and I think, it's just a random factor of the flavour of the personalities who have emerged, just, sort of by accident. Clive Palmer has been the phenomenon of the campaign for me. Assuming the polling is accurate, this could prove to be chimerical. I'm sort of reminded of the British election when all the polls told us that the Liberal Democrats were going to poll nearly 30% of the vote. And the great surprise of that election night was that just evaporated at the last minute. So perhaps we are going to see people in the darkness of the polling booth play it safe and be a bit more conservative. So I'll believe that strength of support when I see it. But even if it doesn't happen, it is telling that his extremely unscripted television advertising campaign, he's, doing undisciplined things that a major party just couldn't get away with in a million years, has really made a lot of people say, good on you for being out there, for presenting ideas, for telling us what you're going to do, and, for being an ideas person, because that's something that the scripts that the major parties very carefully follow don't leave much room for that sort of thing, and there's a yearning for it.
Very quickly, one last question. Are people ever really undecided the night before an election?
Oh, a great many people are undecided until the minute they go into that polling booth. And as evidence of that, we've seen all of these micro parties emerge, which I think are only there to harness votes and move preferences in a particular direction based on catchy names they come up with. So, a lot of people are going to go in there and look at that Senate booth ballot paper in particular, that enormous, endless Senate ballot paper that they'll be dealing with, and they'll look at a party like Stop the Carbon Tax. There are a lot of these parties out there and say, yeah, they'll do. And that could, with the complexity of the Senate contest we face and the amount of preferences harvesting going on, it's clear that indecision, particularly under compulsory voting, is a major factor, not just the night before, but right up to the final minute.